Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Self Pub Sunday. Today, we're joined by Tori Tecken, author of Phase SPFBO 9 entry. Tori, I'm so excited for this chat.
I thank you so much for having me. I'm very, very excited to chat about this with you. And it took me so many times to get SPFBO, like the actual acronyms down. For whatever reason, it's just a very difficult set of letters.
My brain always wants to switch the P and the F.
Yep.
Even though I have it literally written down in front of me.
Yeah.
It just refuses to accept that acronym.
I wonder if that's because we're so used to SFF books, like where
Maybe.
that's, I don't know, maybe.
Or my brain is just difficult. So I want to just start with an icebreaker while people kind of trickle in. And I'll say, anyone out there, if you have questions for Tori, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them when we can. So you are a mom of 3.
Yes.
Plus Pippin, the adorable cat.
Yes. Who's actually sleeping on the bed right behind me right now.
Yes. How do you do it, Tori? How do you find the motivation or the time to write?
It's honestly kind of I think it's very important for parents to have things that they pursue for themselves, even while raising kids, because it's important to keep that for your own mental health and also for your kids to see you going after things and having dreams and, working hard on things. And writing has always kind of been my sanity in a lot of ways. So it just, there were a couple of years where my kids were really young that it was hard to get time because, you always got a baby and your toddler's getting into everything. And, but once they were a little bit more independent, I worked really hard on learning how to write in the midst of the chaos.
I love that point because a lot of times you see parents that seem like they're unhappy in life because they've essentially lost themselves to their kids.
Yeah.
They give their lives over to their kids and they don't have lives of their own.
Yeah.
And then it, trickles over onto the kids.
Yeah.
I love that you kind of take time for yourself because everyone needs to do that, whatever is happening in your life. But you don't often hear parents and especially moms actually acknowledge that and do it. A lot of moms will say, I need to do this, but they don't follow through with it for whatever reason. So I love that. And that segues into our next topic, talking about your writing career. So you talked about how writing has always been a mode of kind of sanity for you. Did you always want to be a writer, or did you have a moment in your life where like, this is exactly what I want to do?
I think I can go back as far as being like 5 or 6 in my playroom. And I used to, at the time, I didn't realize it at the time, obviously, but it was kind of the beginning of epic storytelling for me because I would build these cities and I would have the pirates and I would have the royal family and I'd have and there'd be big battles going on. And it was kind of the foundations, I guess, of what I do now. And writing has just always been something that I knew I really wanted to do. And I think once I was about, honestly, 9 or 10, I knew that this was something that I wanted to do when I was a grown-up. And so, yeah, it's been in my blood forever. So, yeah.
I was always the kid that my sister would play teacher and I would play librarian, where I would line up all of my stuffed animals and they each would have their books and they each had library cards and
nice.
Different stuffed animals would get late fees depending on the week because they were always irresponsible.
Of course, yes.
I would get the late fees.
Yep. It's so funny even now, like watching my kids as they're starting to explore things and have their own personalities and things they enjoy. I'm really looking forward to looking back and seeing, oh, yep, Tristan's always been an animal conservationist, even, like he has his animal encyclopedia memorized, I think, at this point. So it's very cool to see how our early childhood shapes who we are when we're adults.
So I wanted to talk about your writing inspirations, or I like to call them writing heroes.
Yeah.
So Phased is a supernatural book about werewolves, and we don't get those a lot. So I was wondering where you get your inspiration from in your writing.
So for Phased specifically, I've always been really inspired by characters and stories that draw a very strong emotional response from the reader. One of the books that I read fairly early on that I would say would be one of the main inspirations behind how I wrote Phased was White Fang by Jack London. I remember being incredibly blown away by this character who was non-human and never spoke a word during the entire book, but it's just so incredibly emotional and powerful. And I would say later on, Frankenstein is another one that I would attribute to being kind of a Phased influence or inspiration. I have to acknowledge that I don't know if I would say inspired by, I was encouraged to write Phased by the existence of Twilight. Because I was in high school when that came out and all of my girlfriends were reading it and I read them and I was not, I was like, okay, I don't really see why there's this hype around it. But it always kind of bothered me and I was like, well, this could be, I feel like there's such a lost potential here with Supernatural, and then the flood of toxic romance and Supernatural came out. And in 2019 I just decided that I wanted to write a werewolf story because I was like, I want to take my own turn, have a spin at this and see what I can come up with. So yeah,
I love it. I did not fall under the Twilight craze either. I was older when I think I was in college when Twilight came out, and I read the books and I was like, really? This is what everyone's like craving about? Like there's so much better writing out there.
Yep.
And I'm like, why does she like I was so confused by that series. I still am.
Same. Yeah. But I really liked, I thought the supernatural side of all of that was so cool to me. And I was like, well, and especially with werewolves, I've always been fascinated by werewolfism and like, what would it be like to live with something like that? And yeah, there's a lot of very cool potential in that genre for sure.
Yeah. Ever since I was in middle school, I've been obsessed with Dracula. He was my first fictional crush, which is really weird to say out loud, especially as a teenager.
In this community.
People are like, really? Like Dracula? I'm like, yep. So like I went full force into Twilight, like, okay, vampires, yes, let's go. I'm like, this is not how vampires are. Love to go back and read Dracula and then come back.
You're right. Yeah. Well, and it's just in my opinion, it's just such a different level of literature, like, and there's nothing wrong with having books that you read and really love and just it's fun to read them. And, so for people out there that really love Twilight and had a great time with it,
oh yeah,
I don't see anything wrong with that. No. It's just, that was not my cup of tea.
Every book has its reader. And
right.
If you still love Twilight today, good for you. I love it when anyone loves any book.
People are reading.
Okay. I do not complain.
Right.
It could be better books, but okay.
That's when you just subtly suggest, so I love that you loved that. Why don't you try this one next?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to talk spoiler-free chat about Phased. For people out there that haven't read it yet, we won't do the shame on you yet, but you definitely need to read it. So we talked a little bit about how Phased is, this book about werewolves with very emotional characters. Mm-hmm. Can you give us your elevator pitch on Phased?
Yes. So Phased is a story about two werewolf sisters, Val and Lila Blackwood, and they are true bloods, which is the purest form of werewolfism in the world that I created. And they've basically been kept as lab rats their entire lives. They were raised for a bit in the wild, and then they were taken in by an organization that is attempting to kind of suppress werewolves and get them assimilated into human culture. Which basically, if Val and Lila are not able to assimilate into human culture, then they will be sent back to some pretty horrific cells, for lack of a better way to explain that, for the rest of their lives. And it's a story of survival and of trauma and healing and doing the right thing, even when you've been really hurt by the world. And yeah, that's kind of the found family, motley crew, all the things.
So we talked a little bit about, what makes Phased different than, say, the Twilight books, but what makes Phased stand out in the supernatural genre for you?
I think the fact that there is a soft romance subplot in it, but that is not the point of the story. And I think I really wanted to use the kind of plot device of the characters having werewolfism to explore a lot of mental health themes. And that was really where I spent a lot of my intention when I was writing it. And I also think that the character relationships are something I focused on, making them as authentic as possible and really showing a lot of different types of relationship, both positive and negative. And I really didn't want to write 2D characters in this. I wanted it, even the side characters, I really wanted them to have weight behind who they were and what their motives were.
And I love that because as a reader, for me, I tend to gravitate towards the side characters when I'm reading. And so to have side characters that can hold their own was a breath of fresh air. Especially in fantasy. So I loved them. And we'll get to the characters in a minute once we get into the spoiler chat. So where did the kernel of Phased, the idea for Phased, really come from?
Once I knew I wanted to write a book about werewolves, I kind of, whenever I have a new idea, like, I want to write about werewolves. Okay. Then I start asking the what if questions. So, okay, what if there were werewolves in our modern society? What would that look like? Well, there'd probably be an organization that was trying to, make sure that that was safe, and they may or may not be, ethical. What would their, lots of things. And then I knew that I wanted to have a pair of sisters as the main characters, because I really love exploring sibling bonds. I'm an only child, and so sibling bonds have always been something that have been really intriguing to me, and of course watching my own kids now. So I knew I wanted that, and that kind of was where it started. It started much lighter than it ended up being. I actually started trauma therapy about a month after I started writing Phased. And because of that, the story kind of took on its own sort of therapeutic element for me writing it. And it went a lot deeper originally than I was anticipating it going. So, yeah.
Yeah. When I was getting my MFA in nonfiction writing, one of the very first pieces of advice that my advisor gave me was find a good therapist or counselor. Because even if you don't think you're going to need it, you're going to need it. And so that was, my writing was therapeutic in a lot of different senses, because I was writing about my family origins and whatnot. But yeah, like Stephanie said, I love that you kind of took phased and kind of, you both evolved along with your writing.
Yeah.
And you can definitely see that in the writing.
Yeah. I was just going to say, in the very first draft, we actually, and this isn't a spoiler, but you start the book walking into the school with the two of them. And that was the original first draft. And it was much more light, I guess. And now, as you know, the story opens quite differently. And that was, it just became very clear to me that the sisters had a much deeper story to tell than I originally set out for. So
you could tell reading the book that it was very much thought out, and you took your time to make sure it was the story that you wanted to tell, instead of just rushing through to produce a book for people to read. It was a thing of love.
Thank you.
So we talked about where this idea came from. Did the characters or did the story come to you first?
Definitely the characters. I'm very much a character-driven reader and writer. When I start writing, the characters come to me first, and they kind of show up and they start taking on a life of their own. And I just kind of start building the story around them and figuring out who they are, where they came from, what are they afraid of, what do they want, what are they, all of the basic character design questions. And then the story kind of starts to take shape around them. And with Val and Lila, it was very much that way, where they were so vibrant in my mind, and it was not hard to start putting pieces together and delving into their past and who they were. And they were very fun to write.
I thought you did a really good job of balancing the characters and the plot.
Thank you.
Especially when you talk to, writers that are character-driven readers themselves. A lot of the focus in their writing is just on the characters, and the plot kind of takes a back seat. And but I found Phase to be very well balanced, where throughout the book one doesn't take precedence over the other. They kind of drive each other. And so I could really appreciate that in your book.
Thank you. Yeah, that's always my something that I try to focus on a little bit more. And I do have to give a shout out to my editor for Phased, who really did a great job helping me with the story structure. Because with ADHD, I have a hard time with sequential processing. And so sometimes when I'm putting a book together, I'm like, okay, it's really hard for me to make sure that everything lines up in the right way. And my editor Gina was incredible, helping me make sure everything lined up the right way and made sense and was in the right order. And she was great.
Yeah. Well, it all made sense to me.
Great.
And I loved how every time I got to a big incident in the book, I was like, this is so early in the book. In other books, this would be like the inciting incident to go into the climax and the ending. And it was just like, but this is only at 15% in the book. Like, what else is going to come? And then you kept coming across those incidents, and it just kept thinking, well, what else could happen to these characters if all of this has already happened and we're still not even close to the end?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which author I heard the advice from. It's in there somewhere. But there was an author that I was listening to an interview with, and we were talking about how, don't save the good stuff. right? Like put it in there right away when you think of it. Don't try to, oh well, that's only for the ending. Or so I really write that way, where I try to not inhibit big things from happening right away, because as long as it fits and it's an important part of the story, then it just challenges you as an author to, okay, where do we go from here, and how do we continue to ramp up that tension?
Yeah, I loved it because it also kept my attention. I'm a reader, ADHD reader, and I read, 4 to 6 books at one time. And usually I read, like one chapter at a time, and then I go to a different book and read another chapter. And I switch in between chapters, but with Faith, I just wanted to keep reading because I never knew what was going to happen next. And it just, like, I found myself, like, trying to fall asleep at night thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen next to these characters?
Right. Yeah. Oh, that makes me very, I mean, there really isn't a better compliment than that. So I appreciate it.
You kept me up at night after I was completely
well, I'm sorry for the lack of
exhausted.
sleep, but only a little.
It was a strange thing to have, because the week before I started reading Phase, I had been out of town at a work conference, like dealing with, jet lag and different time zones. We were out in Las Vegas for a week, and I was completely exhausted when I got back. We had to spend the night in the Atlanta airport, and unexpectedly, it was a crazy trip. And I got back and I just felt so exhausted. But then I started reading Phase, and I'm like, my body wants to sleep, but my brain is like, no, we can't sleep yet. We need to know what happens.
Yeah.
Just another chapter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's my end goal when I send my book out. Because at first, the book is for me. And as I'm writing it, the book is just for me. And then when it is published, then it becomes for me and everyone else. And it's cool to see people emotionally connect with the characters to that extent. There's really no better feeling, I think, as an author.
I mean, this morning I was finishing up while I was doing laundry at the laundromat, and I was sitting there at these like very uncomfortable plastic table, and my laundry was done, but I had to finish this chapter, and I was just crying in the middle of the laundromat. People were looking at me like, is that lady okay? Like the weirdest looks, and I'm just like, it's okay.
Yeah, I would, finishing Phase in a public place, I could see could be a little bit stressful.
So we talk spoiler free. Now I want to go into spoiler chat, which I know is your favorite part of these. And I'll warn our audience out there, anyone that's watching live or watching the playback of this, that we're going to dig deep into Phase now. So if you don't want to be spoiled about this book, go read the book. It's a really quick read. Then come back and watch the rest of this. If you don't have Phase yet, there's a link in the description of this video where you can get it. Go read it and then come back. Like, I literally read this in like a couple days. So it's super quick read, super, super good read. So you have been warned now. So earlier we were talking about your characters. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I loved every single one of your characters.
Yay!
I think my favorite was the human. Christopher. Yeah, my brain was blanking on his name. I think because as a kid, I was always kind of drawn towards those weird topics that people would think you're weird if you obsessed over. Mm-hmm. And you kind of got that, at least I got that same kind of vibe with Christopher. He was obsessed with learning everything he could about werewolves. And it kind of drew him, into this friendship and this relationship. Yep. But I was always, whenever he was on the page, I was like, what is Christopher going to do now? What is he going to say now? What is he going to bring her now?
Yeah.
But I wondered if you had favorite characters or who was your easiest character to write?
Oh gosh. I think there's a couple of them that were easier for different reasons. So the characters in Phased are all very heavily based on, most of them are very heavily based on real people. And so Val is basically me at 17. And Lila is very heavily based on my best friend, Sarah. And Christopher is actually very heavily based on my husband, Ben. And because of that, it was easy to draw on those moments where I was kind of stuck on, okay, what do I think this character would do in a situation like this? I kind of thought about, and obviously these people knew as I was writing the books, I would just call Sarah and be like, all right, here's the situation. What would you do? And with easy writing, I would say Val's very easy for me to write, because it almost feels like cheating in a way, because she's very me, and so it was very easy to kind of tap into that past experience and remember, kind of explore who I was when I was 16, 17 years old, and how I responded to things, and just that part made it very easy. Jules was probably my favorite. I don't know if favorite isn't the right word. I'm not supposed to have favorites, but Jules was also very easy to write because she was always very fun. It was fun to play her off of the other characters, and she kind of is the little mom of the group, So yeah, but I don't know that any of them were really difficult. Cormoran, I had some moments with Cormoran where I had to kind of figure out, okay, I really want to figure out more where she's coming from. And I actually, at some point, may write a prequel novella that is her story. But yeah, other than that, I think for the most part, they actually they played nicely.
One of the things that I loved about your writing was that it was so heavily based in essentially like the real world that at times I had to remind myself that they were werewolves, because they went through, everyday problems, just in a werewolf world.
Right.
And it was just like, you kind of like, whenever I review a Terry Pratchett book, I'm like, he takes these real world issues and puts them in his crazy disc world. And it's both crazy, but also makes 100% sense.
Yeah.
And I got very similar feelings reading Phased, where we have these, not only the real world problems of, teenagers and all of the problems that come with teenage years and high school and whatnot, but also, you got the issues of, racism with the different classes of the werewolves and whatnot, and humans versus werewolves and all of that, and the True Bloods mixing in. And so you saw these different levels of real world issues building into this fictional world of werewolves. I kept having to be like, these are werewolves. That's what they're talking about. I'm like, wait, why are they talking about fangs? Oh, they're werewolves.
Yep. There are definitely some fangs involved. I don't know. I think when we talk about immersion as readers, I think part of that is, when we drop ourselves into a world in a fantasy book, you want to feel like the characters have just been in this world forever. You don't want to feel like the characters are like, oh, wait, what is this? Because they know, because they've been there. You weren't necessarily, but I think part of that immersion process is the characters believing in the world that they're in. So yeah, I think, and part of that is how immersed can the writer get in their own world to write it, you know, because if we don't believe it, we can't write it that way.
Absolutely. So you talked about how the caretaker was hard at times. Was there ever a character that, like, whenever you came up to them in the story, you're like, oh no, here we go again?
I mean, Carrington is, I can't call him any very mean names on YouTube, but you know, I think for both Cormoran and Carrington, though, one of the things that I kept going back to was when you there are so many people in history that so deeply believe that they're doing what's right, that they have that, it's a very deep belief that they can't shake, and that becomes dangerous when they're willing to justify it at any cost, especially when it's a cost to someone else. Mm-hmm. And I think for Carrington, that's very much the approach I took. With Cormoran, she's been essentially to some extent kind of brainwashed by because she also believes that she's doing the right thing, that she's helping. And obviously there's a boundary there where she, you know, changes her mind at the end and tries to help. But in the beginning, she truly believes that the best thing for Val and Lila is what she's doing. And she sees the damage that it's causing, but she's not willing to accept that, you know, it's that she's helping cause the problems. So that took a lot of just making sure that I was keeping those mindsets in those characters and making sure that I was like, okay, Carrington 100% believes, like in my mind, he's kind of what I would consider a light villain, like Javert from Les Miserables, right? Where he so firmly believes, nope, I have to put Valjean in jail because that's the only right thing to do. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's hard for me to write those characters because I get frustrated with them as much as the readers do, I think. But yeah, they were, and obviously like Jackson, nobody likes a school bully, right? Poor Jackson. He went through his own stuff. But yeah.
So switching from characters now, let's talk about some scenes in the book.
Okay.
One of my favorite scenes was at the very end when they go back to Christopher's house and they're all in the woods and they go off hunting together. One of the things that I felt made Faze different than the rest of supernatural books that I've read, at least, is that you have a sense of hope with Faze. Even at the darkest of times, there's still a glimmer of hope in it.
Yeah.
And at the end in that scene, it was just full of hope. I was wondering if you had a favorite scene that you to write.
I think one that very early on in the book, actually, that has probably was one of the first scenes I think I thought of when I started writing the book was the dodgeball scene. And that was actually a scene that my editor wanted me to cut out. And that was like the one author trump card that I pulled. And I said, I can't, it's the I can't cut the dodgeball scene. I love it so much. And I think it does so much to kind of give you a glimpse into the characters right away. And a little bit of pack dynamics and that kind of stuff. So that one is just fun. I love the scene where Val and Lila have their argument in the bunker, because I think it was one of the hardest scenes in the book for me to write, actually, because I needed to show the conflict between the two of them and how so much of Faze kind of circles around how these two characters who've been through very similar traumas are coping with it so incredibly differently, which was an important thing that I wanted to show in this, because that's real life. You know, two people that go through very similar trauma can react completely differently to it. And there, you know, there was a point where they can't stand up under this pressure forever. It's going to come out and it's going to snap, and it's going to be with each other because that's their safe space. So that scene was hard to write, but is probably one of the ones I'm most proud of in the book. The snow globe with Christopher is another one. It was fun to be able, like, it was sad, but it was fun to be able to write I felt like it was there's a lot of sweetness to their love story, and I really enjoyed writing it. This was just a really fun book to write. Like, there's a huge list. I could keep going, but yeah, it was a really, I wrote it very quickly. It only took me 4 months to write the first draft, which now, a year into the book I'm currently writing, feels like really fast. But yeah, it just feels like the scenes just kind of came together. And I think part of that was just because the characters honestly sort of took on a life of their own, and I was just there to write it down. So yeah.
So you mentioned one scene that was hard to write. Were there other scenes that you just had to take a lot of passes at to get right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Well, eventually, there were a few scenes that I actually cut out of the final draft. At one point, there was a school dance that happened in the book, and I ended up taking that out because I was like, this really doesn't, it feels very cliche, and it doesn't really add anything, and it's just, you know, not really helpful to the story. There was a couple of scenes. The one with the zoo actually was one that I rewrote a few times, and trying to get that right with all of the, you know, the moment with Lila and the wolves lining up behind her in the glass cage, or behind the glass, and the kind of snap at Jules, like that whole arc, I rewrote a couple of times because I didn't want it to feel forced or cliche. Like, I really needed to get into Lila's head a little bit more. And since Val is the character that I'm most relate to, Lila was a little harder for me to get in her head in moments like that. But yeah.
That one felt like, okay, there's a shift in the narrative here. Because up until then, Val was kind of the character that always pushed back on things.
Yeah.
And Lila was the character that just went with, you know, the other kids. But at that moment, things completely flipped. And I was like, okay, something's happening here. I had to read that scene twice to make sure that my brain was reading the right names, because it felt so natural for Val. I was like, wait, did that say Lila?
Yep. Lila has a couple spicy moments in there for sure. I think, you know, the biggest difference I saw in writing the two of them is that it took so much more to push Lila to express her emotions, whereas Val had a harder time not expressing, you know. And it was harder for her to really pull back and suppress all of that, you know, emotion and anger and everything that she was feeling. So yeah.
So what do you want readers, or what do you hope readers to come away with after reading Faced?
Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier was a big piece for me, is that, you know, these characters have been through so much trauma and struggles, and that even when everything is really dark, and even when you're struggling and dealing with traumas and life and feeling like the world keeps spinning, even when you're trying to make it stand still, that there is still that hope that you can still, you know, like Val, she made friends. She and Lila both, they made friends. They did the right thing even when it was hard, and they stood up for people who, they didn't have to at the end. And I think that was a really big, important theme for me to put into the story, because I didn't want it to just be about the trauma. I wanted it to be about their resilience to it and what they were capable of despite it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That definitely showed throughout the book that, trauma was a big part of the characters, but it wasn't the characters themselves.
Right.
They had a life. They could have a life outside of the trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to talk about future writing projects that you have. You mentioned you're working on a book right now. It felt like when I got to the end of Phase that there was still more to the story that we haven't gotten yet.
Yes.
So I was wondering if there's anything that you can or want to tell us about future writing projects, whether Phase related or non-Phase related.
Yeah. So the one I'm working on right now is a epic fantasy novel that's the first in a trilogy, and that's going to be called The Bloodstones. And I do not have an elevator pitch for it yet. But that one takes place in a world that I've been building since college, so about over 10 years now. And I'm very, very excited. I have about 3 chapters left to write in it, and I'm just so excited to hopefully get it out by the end of this year. Phased related. So originally Phase was meant to be a standalone, and I can actually blame Sarah for this, my best friend, because I got to the end and I sent her the book and she read it and she goes, "Oh, well, it'd be really cool if you wrote an epilogue because and so yeah, I ended up opening a door for myself that I wasn't originally intending. But I do have about a third, probably about a quarter of the manuscript for the sequel to Phased, which will be called True Blood. And that one, it is only going to be a duology, despite anybody suggesting any epilogues to book 2. I'm very excited. It's going to jump ahead about 3 years. And the characters are older. There's going to be a lot more exploration of Carrington and his motives and plans, and how Val and Lila are continuing to deal with the aftermath of everything that happened in Phased. And yeah, I'm very, very excited about it. So
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, Tori, those are all the questions that I had for you. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we haven't touched yet?
I'm trying to think. I always ask everyone what their favorite character was, so that was an easy one that you were ahead of me on that one. One of the things that I think I have kind of stopped marketing, or not marketing, but describing to people Phased as a YA, because it's theoretically it fits in with that category, but I feel like that almost gives it a connotation that isn't really fair. And as a experienced librarian, I would be curious on your take on that, having read it.
I think even though it has young characters in it, I feel like the themes that are explored in it are much darker and deeper than you normally get in YA books.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would classify it as, I mean, I hate the term YA, young adult, because to different people it can mean different things.
Right.
To me, when I think of YA books, I think of like late teenage years, maybe early 20s. Mm-hmm. And I think, like, I want to say that Phase is geared towards younger adults, but mm-hmm. not the YA young adult audience. But it's also one of those books that was written so well that no matter what your age, you can relate to it and you can find something in it to take away from. Because, I mean, even though the main characters are teenagers, we've all been a teenager.
Right.
So even if you're 65 and you're reading Phased, you can still find something in it to relate to and to come away with. So I think the themes of it, with the trauma and the exploration of, you know, the abuse in Carrington and all of that, make it much darker than your typical YAs. Now, of course, there are, you know, in every genre, you have those books that kind of go outside the genre. So there are some, not to say that there are YA books that aren't dark and deep like that, but the majority of YA books that I've read, at least, even when they go into dark topics, it's kind of with a lighter hand.
Yeah.
They might, like, you know, mention the trauma that Lila and Vel have experienced, but we don't see that firsthand. Right. Where in Phased, we see it firsthand throughout the story, and we see it even in flashbacks.
Right.
And so, to me, at least, I would qualify it as an adult book, but probably the younger adults would get the most out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. You can see why it's been kind of hard to, like, to figure out where to categorize it, because, yeah, like you said, it's has YA characters, but adult themes.
Right.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish that bookstores would just get rid of all of the genres and just have all of their books, like, mixed together and let people decide, like, what they want on their own. As an organizational wise, that would be an absolute nightmare.
Right.
And even like me going into, you know, I have a favorite bookstore here, McKay's, which is a used book, like, warehouse.
Yeah.
And they've got organization, but in that organization, it's disorganized. And I would, like, thought, you know, I thinking, okay, I just want books to be everywhere. But then thinking of myself going in as a book buyer and trying to find something very specific would be completely frustrating.
Right. Yeah.
Question from Palmer. Do you consider paranormal to be YA? No, not specifically. It can be YA, but you can have plenty of paranormal. I mean, the Dresden Files is paranormal, and that's definitely not
YA. Yeah.
So, you know, you can have YA books that have paranormal in them, but not all paranormal books have to be YA, or all YA books have to be.
I think those two terms have kind of become so intertwined simply because it's been such a huge fad, I guess, from the last, and it's been a while. I mean, it's been a fad that's hung around a long time of YA books largely having a you know, pretty big offering of paranormal and supernatural in them. So I think that's one of the reasons why sometimes it can be, because I know, like, I'm fighting an uphill battle with Phased, which I knew when I published it, because when people hear it's a supernatural with YA protagonists, well, it's Twilight. Right. No. Specifically not.
Right.
But yeah, I think that's definitely, it's hard to explain that to people, I think, sometimes.
Yeah.
I did want to throw in an Easter egg for anybody that's reading Phased and is interested. So the DAO board of, like, regents or whatever you want to call it, they are all, except for Carrington, they are all named after some of my most influential villains from different books, and they have, like, their names are inspired by different villain characters. So
I love it.
Yep.
Carrington, now that you mentioned that, Carrington kind of reminded me of almost a Lord Veterinary because he's so intelligent. He's much more evil than Veterinary is. I don't find Veterinary to be evil in the City Watch books, but on the level of having this villain that is just so smart. I was getting Veterinary vibes the whole time whenever he came on the page.
Yeah, I kind of approached him as he's that kind of light villain archetype, like somebody like Javert from Les Mis, but he's first and foremost an emotional manipulator, and social manipulator, and that's really where his villainy, I guess, is rooted. And I'm going to be exploring that more in True Blood. So
awesome. I'm excited. Well, if there's nothing else that you have, there's no other questions in the crowd, say, Tori, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone out there who either watched this live or is watching this back. If you're watching the playback and you have questions for Tori or comments for Tori, feel free to put them in the chat and I will get them over to her. We'll get you answers however we need to. Join us at the end of the month on, I have to look at my calendar, the 27th, for our next episode of Self Pub Sunday. We will have Mark Cushion on, and we'll be talking about Little White Ham. So join us then for our next episode, and I hope you all have a fantastic day, and thank you for joining.
Thanks, Kate.